Good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference titled Protecting Alaska's Children from Neurodevelopmental Harm, Project TENDR's new consensus statement on the environmental chemicals contributing to neurodevelopmental disabilities, with Project TENDR co-founders and co-chairs Maureen Swanson and Dr. Irva Hertz-Picciotto. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. Our speakers will be co-presenting this morning from one set of slides. I sent a link to their presentation earlier this morning along with the call-in instructions. If you haven't done so already, load the PDF so you can follow along. Project TENDR stands for Targeting Environmental Neuro-Developmental Risks and is a collaborative effort of scientists, clinicians, policymakers, and advocates that aims to decrease the incidence of neurodevelopmental disorders by reducing neurotoxicant exposures that contribute to them. Ms. Swanson, as well as a number of other scientists and health professionals who have been a part of Project TENDR, will be speaking in Alaska in early October at a Children's Environmental Health Summit convened by Alaska Community Action on Toxics. The purpose of the gathering is to bring scientists, healthcare professionals, tribal leaders, policymakers, teachers, parents, students, and advocates together to discuss the latest science and develop recommendations for policy actions to protect the health of children. This summit will address environmental health and health disparities of children at the top of the world and ways that we can work together to ensure healthy homes, child care facilities, schools, and communities. And we really hope that many of you will be able to join us for the summit, which will be held on October 5th and 6th, 2016 at Alaska Pacific University in Anchorage. You can find more information about the summit on our website at akaction.org. And now it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce our guest speakers. Maureen Swanson is National Coordinator of the Healthy Children Project of the Learning Disabilities Association of America, focused on raising awareness of environmental factors linked to learning and developmental disabilities, and on promoting policies and practices to reduce toxic chemical exposures, especially for pregnant women and children. And Dr. Irva Hertz-Picciotto is Director of the Environmental Health Sciences Center at the University of California, Davis. She is an environmental epidemiologist with over 300 scientific publications addressing environmental exposures, their interactions with nutrition, genes, or social factors, and their effects on pregnancy, the newborn, and child development. She directs CHARGE, which stands for Childhood Autism Risk from Genes and Environment, and MARBLES, Markers of Autism Risk in Babies, Learning Early Signs, to search for early markers that will predict autism starting in pregnancy. Welcome to both of you. We're so pleased you could join us to discuss Project TENDR. And you may go ahead and begin.
All right. Thank you, Diana. This is Maureen Swanson and with the Learning Disabilities Association of America. And if you'd all like to start with our opening slide, and I'll say that we sent Diana the slides, and this one was supposed to include my name, so we'll get that corrected slide to her after this call so that everybody has both my information and Irva's. But we co-founded and are co-directors of Project TENDR, and that's Targeting Environmental Neuro-Developmental Risks. And as Diana said, Dr. Hertz-Picciotto is at UC Davis at the Mind Institute, and I direct a Children's Environmental Health Project for the Learning Disabilities Association of America, headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Next slide. So one of the aspects of Project TENDR that is unique and significant is the breadth and depth of the experts involved, of the scientists who are environmental health researchers and government scientists, and are coming from the fields of epidemiology, the studies of chemicals and their effects in human populations, toxicology, which is laboratory science, looking at these chemicals and their health effects, and exposure scientists, looking at where these chemicals are coming from and how they get into our bodies and brains. And all of these distinguished scientists from a range of disciplines joined, we brought them together with health professionals, including obstetricians, pediatricians, nurses, also people representing African American physicians, Hispanic Physicians Association, and Asian Pacific Islander physicians, along with children's environmental health advocates. And in that group, we are so pleased to have Pam Miller be part of TENDR with her great expertise on all of these chemicals and their effects on not only on children's health, but also on community health, and especially for Native Alaskan community members. So, oh, and I should say that with our government representatives, we had representatives from EPA, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the California EPA, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and one other National Institute of Health agencies. So TENDR is unique in having brought this level and breadth of experts together to focus on environmental chemicals that are contributing to neurodevelopmental disorders. So our group came together out of a sense of urgency over the increase in learning and developmental and behavior problems. And you'll see in the corner of the slide there's a little graph that shows the rapid rise in autism spectrum disorder over a 14-year period. And that increase cannot be explained purely by greater awareness and changing diagnostic criteria. So that was one of the factors that brought this group together, was urgent concern over increasing incidence of autism and ADHD and other learning and behavior problems. The next slide, please. So our mission is to reduce the exposure levels of environmental chemicals or pollutants that contribute to risks for neurodevelopmental disorders as a means to achieve the public health goal, the long-term goal of lowering the incidence of these conditions. So in addition to the concern over the incidence of neurodevelopmental disorders, we also came together because the science was ready. Even 10 years ago, this Project TENDR and our consensus statement would not have been possible. But there's been such an advance in the science over the last 10 years. There have been multiple studies conducted on a wide range of diverse populations, and those studies have all produced similar results, that you have repeated demonstration of links between chemical exposures, especially during prenatal development and early childhood, and impairments in cognitive function. So disrupted brain development, resulting in IQ deficits, behavioral problems, attention problems, and the symptoms or the diagnosis of neurodevelopmental disorders. Next slide, please. So these neurodevelopmental disorders are complex, and so many of us now have a family member or a friend or a friend's family member whose family includes someone with one of these disorders or one or more of these disorders. And they're complex, and genetics definitely play a role, as do other factors such as nutrition, social stressors, disease. But the role of environmental chemicals, the contribution of toxic chemicals to these disorders, is a part that we can do something about. And so Project TENDR is focusing on toxic chemicals, in part because that's the piece that we can affect, that we can prevent the contribution of chemicals to these disorders. Right, next slide, please. So how do we achieve that goal, to reduce exposures to these chemicals that are widespread, that these chemicals are in our air and in our food, in our water, and in our homes and schools through products and food. So how do we achieve the goal of exposure reduction, and especially with an eye to how do we protect our most vulnerable? And during brain development, and I should say during fetal development, and through about age 2 or 3, the brain is developing so rapidly and is very susceptible to harm, even from very tiny levels of toxic chemicals. So exposures to the pregnant woman, or exposures to the baby or the child that would have no effect on the woman, on the mother herself, or would have no effect in an adult, can do a great deal of harm to the developing fetus or to the baby. And also, children have behaviors such as hand-to-mouth behaviors. They put toys in their mouths, they put their hands in their mouths, dust and dirt, and those behaviors also increase their exposures to toxic chemicals. And then there's also their metabolism. So children, for their body weight, they take in more air and food, and they're ingesting more of these chemicals on a per pound basis than adults do. So for all of those reasons, they are especially vulnerable to harm from toxic chemicals. Next slide, please. Now, the problem of environmental chemicals, this slide, especially that first bullet about 80,000 chemicals in commerce, pertains to what we call industrial chemicals. But there's tens of thousands of these chemicals in commerce that are used in products, that are emitted to the air and soil and water. And the vast majority of them are not tested for harm to human health. And even fewer are tested for prenatal exposures and impacts on brain function. So some of the problems that are listed there with learning, behavior, social skills, mental health issues, those are considered subtle effects of these chemicals. They're not acute effects that are perhaps a physical impairment that would be apparent at birth. So these neurological impairments are usually not immediately obvious. Some of them don't show up until the child is a couple of years old and can be diagnosed. Some of them, such as ADHD, might not be apparent until a child starts school. So very, very few of these chemicals have been tested for harm to brain development and function. And then there's other chemicals. So these chemicals that are called chemicals in commerce would be covered under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And then there's also chemicals such as pesticides that Irva will go into later that are addressed differently in our regulatory system. But our main point is that our current regulatory system is a patchwork of laws that has been wholly inadequate for protecting young brains. Our system of assessing the scientific evidence and acting on chemicals is broken and has resulted in great harm to our children's developing minds. Next slide, please. So to address this problem, Project TENDR, we take a two-pronged approach, and you'll see in our consensus statement, which I know we've made available and is available on our website, we decided, all of our experts, the scientists and health professionals and advocates, decided to target a short list of environmental chemicals to highlight the larger problem of all the toxic chemicals that present an emerging concern or have not been tested at all for effects on brain development. So this short list of chemicals, which Irva and I will provide some detail on, these are chemicals that are, for which we don't feel there is any further study required. They clearly, the evidence is clear and substantial and shows that these chemicals are harming brain development and contributing to neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism and ADHD and learning disabilities. And then, so the consensus statement lays out those environmental chemicals that are our example chemicals. And then it also, we want to take on the systemic problems in the regulatory policies and implementation. And so Project TENDR will be addressing and seeking to improve ways that the chemical evidence or the evidence on the chemicals is assessed, and so that we can better test and identify and act to reduce chemicals that are toxic to brain development. So our first huge step was to publish a consensus statement in July 1st in the journal Environmental Health Perspectives, which is the journal of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And I'll get into the consensus statement a little bit more in a minute. But on the next slide, slide number 8, you can see a list of our consensus statement authors. And we don't expect you to read through all of those names right now, but it just gives you a good sense of really the amazing expertise that came together, and the very distinguished group of people that came together in Project TENDR and co-authored this consensus statement. And I'll tell you, it's a group of very cautious, careful people, scientists and health professionals and advocates who spent hours, hundreds of hours, looking and assessing the science and debating it, and then drafting and redrafting the statement. And you'll see that Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who's director of the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, is one of our co-authors. And then a whole range of scientists and physicians and nurses and advocates from across the country. On the next slide, you'll see the organizations so far that are endorsing or supporting the consensus statement. And we're very pleased to have such, such distinguished organizations nationally and internationally starting to endorse the consensus statement. And one of our next steps is further outreach, and the consensus statement is being considered for endorsement or support by many other scientific and medical and education and environmental health groups right now. But there you'll see some of them, including the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Nurses Association, the Endocrine Society, the National Association of Pediatric Nurse Practitioners, the National Hispanic Medical Association, the National Medical Association. So quite a group of endorsing and supporting organizations so far. And that's in addition to all of the organizations that are represented by co-authors of the statement who are listed on the previous slide. Now, a word about the consensus statement. If you'll go to the next slide, which is slide number 10, the consensus statement does a couple of things. As I said, first, the consensus statement identifies a short list of chemicals for which the evidence is so clear and compelling that these chemicals are increasing children's risks for neurodevelopmental disorders, and for which, as I said, we don't need further study, we just need to eliminate them from use to protect healthy brain development. But those chemicals are examples of our failure to protect children, a failure of our regulatory system, and sometimes of our market system as well. And so they point to the larger issue of all of the chemicals that are showing signs of concern to brain development or have not been tested at all for harm to brain development. And Irva and I, and along with everyone in Project TENDR, have always seen a consensus statement as a foundation. It's not an end in itself. It was our first major step to say definitively with all of these distinguished scientific and health experts, here's what the science says. It's sufficient, it's clear, toxic chemicals are contributing to neurodevelopmental harm and disorders, and then we need to do something about it. The consensus statement is also a national call to action. So you'll see there in the little white box that we considered for our short list of chemicals, scientific evidence of harm, widespread exposures. 90% of pregnant women have these chemicals in their bodies, and so the developing fetus is exposed, and that reduction is feasible. It's very doable. We know what to do to reduce and eliminate exposures to these chemicals. Next slide, please. So Irva and I'll do the first two chemicals, and then Irva will do the next three. And I should add that, if you'll go back and look at the slide again, that has a short list, our short list of chemicals, that we are developing recommendations now as part of TENDR's next phase for reductions for all of these chemicals. And Irva will share the recommendations on lead that have been developed. And in addition to those four chemicals, lead, organophosphate pesticides, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are flame retardants, and air pollution, we also name in the consensus statement, we name phthalates as a group of chemicals that are a prime example of an emerging threat to brain development. And phthalates, Irva will provide some detail on phthalates, but they're used as plasticizers, and they're also used in personal care and cleaning products in the fragrance part of those products. So phthalates could be on that slide as an example of an emerging concern to brain development. So I'll finish up by talking about lead and then about the flame retardants. So lead is an environmental chemical, a heavy metal with which I think everybody is all too familiar, and we all may have thought that lead was pretty much taken care of when our government got lead out of gasoline in the late 1970s, and then lead was removed from paint sold to consumers, residential paints. But as we know from Flint, Michigan, and from Cleveland, and from cities in New Jersey and New York, and schools, and now one of the congressional buildings now has been found to have lead in the pipes. Lead is far from a problem that we have solved, and lead contamination is everywhere. And it's a tragedy, really, that we had an issue that we could have taken care of 3 or 4 decades ago, and we failed to do so. So lead exposure is primarily from peeling and chipping paint in older houses. There's also lead, as we all know now, in some water pipes, and especially if those water pipes corrode. Battery recycling and other industrial processes can emit large amounts of lead into the air and also contaminate the soil. And then lead is found in a wide range of products. I was surprised when the Project TENDR scientists and experts started pulling together all of the information on lead and sharing it, how many products really still contain lead. Aviation gas for small planes, cosmetics, bullets, lead fishing weights, so some children's toys. And what we do know for certain is that there is no safe level of lead for children. That has been stated by the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that there's no safe level of lead. And we also have over 150 years of documentation on lead's effect on children, including loss of IQ, developmental delays, ADHD, learning disabilities. So lead is kind of the poster child for a substance that even at very low levels, levels below 5 micrograms per deciliter, is detrimental to brain development and to learning. And these effects persist, and they don't go away. And so opportunities for exposure reduction, Irva will get into this more, but in a general sense, it includes remediating current lead-contaminated areas. So cleaning up or replacing soil, chipped paint, replacing water pipes, and then banning lead from products and ensuring that there are no new uses of lead allowed. And all of that takes money, and so that's one of the big issues right now is funding that cleanup. Okay, next slide, please. And then I will conclude my part with looking at the PBDEs, which are flame retardants. And I know many of you in Alaska have a lot of expertise on these yourselves. And Alaska has a bill moving through, I believe, your state legislature that ACAT and Pam and Diana and others have worked hard on that would address not just PBDEs, but some of the other flame retardants as well that are posing a threat to children's health and brain development. So, and I should say Pam Miller has chaired our, is the chair of the Project TENDR flame retardants work group. So we are appreciative of her great expertise in this area. PBDEs have largely been phased out. They're not being produced anymore for the most part. They, through voluntary agreements between the industry and the United States government, they are no longer being added to products, but they are persistent, and they will be around in our homes, in our landfills, in our schools for decades to come. The PBDE flame retardants are used in upholstered furniture, in electronics enclosures, in children's products, including nap mats and nursing pillows and car seats, in fabrics, sometimes in insulation, in mattresses. They are everywhere. And there is very clear evidence, in fact, in the span of 5 years, 3 separate national studies, 3 separate studies, one in California, one in Ohio, and one in New York, looking at very different populations of pregnant women and children, hundreds of pregnant women and children, all had strikingly similar results. And that's that prenatal exposures to everyday levels of PBDE flame retardant chemicals, the higher levels of exposures are associated with loss of IQ and ADHD symptoms, and those problems persist. The studies, all 3 of the studies, have followed those pregnant women and babies as the children grew and entered school, and they are still tracking and showing those intellectual impairments and behavior and attention problems. PBDEs disrupt the endocrine system, so they interfere with the thyroid hormone, and healthy thyroid is essential for healthy brain development. Opportunities for exposure reduction include replacing old furniture, which is not always an easy thing to do, certainly. Wet mopping, vacuuming, washing your hands. PBDEs migrate from products into household dust. So doing a good job of keeping that dust, getting that dust out of your house will help to reduce levels of PBDE exposures. And I'll conclude by saying that all of these chemicals that are our prime example chemicals of the harm to brain development, they also illustrate the issue of regrettable substitution. And Irva will address that in a few minutes. But PBDEs, especially now that they are phased out, the chemical makers are replacing the PBDEs with flame retardant chemicals that include bromine and chlorine and are very similar in chemical structure to the PBDEs. And now we have emerging scientific evidence that these replacement flame retardants are also a problem and harmful to brain development. And then I'll just add one other issue on the flame retardants is that the furniture makers have found that they do not need to use flame retardant chemicals to make their products safe. The flame retardant chemicals, not only were they heavily used in furniture, in foam, upholstered furniture, but they were not effective in preventing fires. So a lot of furniture makers, now if you go out to buy a couch or chair, the good news is that many of the furniture makers, including Ashley Furniture, which is the biggest furniture maker and retailer in the country, IKEA, Crate and Barrel, Macy's, they have eliminated all flame retardants from their upholstered furniture. So there's a ray of hope on PBDEs. And now I'll turn things over to Irva.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just move along. Let's go to the next slide, which is about organophosphate pesticides. The organophosphate pesticides were actually recent. So the exposure to organophosphate pesticides is through household pest control. Those containers up on the upper right indicate some of the kinds of products that have contained organophosphates at least in the past, and there was a ban on the use of some of the organophosphate pesticides in household products around 2000, but that not all of them, and they continue to be used in agriculture. So that is a source of exposure for people who work in agriculture, as well as for all of us because of the residues that remain on our foods. And for those who live in areas close to agricultural applications, and this could be even 5 miles out, there's documented drift from those applications for the ambient air. Then as for some of these other chemicals that Maureen already talked about, there are in fact strong associations that have been shown with cognitive impairments manifested as decreased IQ points and learning and memory deficits, as well as increased risk for autism and also symptoms for ADHD. Of course, pesticides at really high exposures can result in really frank toxicity, poisonings, but we are talking about those lower level exposures that may happen chronically over time. There's also a very powerful study that came out of Columbia University that showed changes in brain function found on MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, of brains of children. The little insert at the lower right actually shows areas of the brain that were differentially differentially affected in terms of the volume and the size of those areas in children who had higher exposures prenatally to chlorpyrifos, one of the organophosphates, and comparing those people to the ones whose mothers had lower levels circulating in their blood during the pregnancy. And these differences in the volume were in areas that had to do with social cognition, emotional control, and a number of other key functions in the brain that could be related to both autism and ADHD, as well as to the effects on executive function and cognitive impairments. So the opportunities for exposure reduction are primarily through non-toxic alternatives, and that would be both at sort of the individual level in the home, but also what we do in terms of the products that are produced on the market and developed. Organic farming, it has been shown that children who have been given a diet of only organic produce have dramatic reductions in the urinary metabolites of these these organophosphate pesticides. So washing fruit that does, particularly the fruit that doesn't have any peel, so that the pesticides could be directly on the part that you eat, is also important. And those fruits are the ones where fruits and also vegetables that you would want to be purchasing organic if you could. Of course, one of the problems is that organic food is more expensive than food that's produced through conventional methods, and this really raises the question of environmental justice, that it is more costly and too costly for some people to reduce their exposures. Next one is air pollution, and air pollution, of course, is very well known for its respiratory effect, which is people associate with air pollution. Most air pollution in this country is now due to motor vehicle traffic, although certainly there are still industries that emit into the atmosphere as well, although many of our dirtier industries have been shifted abroad. So again, this is sort of on the global scale a bit of an environmental justice issue as well, more than a bit, in fact. The literature on air pollution does, however, show that there are cognitive skills that are in which kids will score more poorly if they've had higher air pollution, particularly in their early life. And there are a number of animal experiments that also show rodents that do not learn as well, and their general cognition and memory and so forth are impaired by many of the chemicals that are in air pollution. I would add that air pollution that we, the ambient air pollution, much of which is from exhaust from motor vehicles, contains many of the same chemicals that we see in cigarette smoke and wood burning and coal burning. In other words, fossil fuels, no matter what the form of our use of them, when you burn them, you get many of these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and other volatile organic compounds that are shown to get into the brain and impair its development. The opportunities for exposure reduction, of course, a major step forward can be more use of public transportation, so there are fewer vehicles, and of course public transportation that has converted to non-diesel fuels, of course, is better than the diesel fuels, and then use of bicycle and pedestrian walkways by people, but also in the city planning to build those opportunities in. And of course, many of our older cities, things were actually better planned for not relying quite so heavily on motor vehicles. And so the Northeast, provides more public transportation often than some of the west of our country that was developed, populated a lot somewhat later. Technological advances such as the hybrid vehicles and all-electric vehicles, I think, hold great promise. Moving the fleet towards those will definitely improve the quality of our air. And because air pollution, of course, has these many other effects, as well as the PBDE, organophosphates, and lead, they do more than just hurt brain development. Reducing exposure actually can have broader health impacts. So we shouldn't forget that, even though TENDR did put itself together with the idea of this focus on child neurodevelopment. The phthalates, as Maureen mentioned, at the time that we were trying to select our short list, there was some controversy within TENDR. There have actually been more studies since then, and We haven't yet done a poll to know where the sentiment of the group is, but definitely there was concern that this is an emerging group, chemical in terms of the literature is emerging on it. Phthalates are in fact very widely used. Food is often contaminated because of plastics in the equipment where they are processed and of course the packaging. There are phthalates are used in personal care products by being something of a solvent for the fragrances, and so anything that says fragrance on the label, or parfum, which is kind of the French word sometimes used in our packaging, those contain phthalates as part of the delivery system of the scent. Vinyl flooring, phthalates are actually part of the vinyl flooring themselves, and the amount of phthalates that actually off-gas from vinyl flooring is actually quite substantial. And of course, vinyl flooring, well, not of course, but vinyl flooring is actually different from the sort of natural materials that are made of, like, basically linoleum, the old linoleum, and sort of newer versions of that that do not contain the phthalates. And usually the vinyl ones have a little bit of a shinier surface, and sometimes they basically, the design on them is just sort of printed on the top. And then children's toys and other products. And so phthalates are really in a wide range of kinds of products, building materials also not mentioned on this slide. And everyone is exposed to them. Now, they are associated in a number of studies with either ADHD behaviors or IQ loss, autistic symptoms, as well as internalizing and externalizing behaviors as measured in really young children. Sometimes the effects look different in boys than girls, and I think this is something that is still the subject of continuing research to really understand. They are endocrine disrupting compounds similar to the PBDEs, but they are more short-lived. They don't last in the body as long. But if you have these kinds of products that you're using all the time, then you are continually being exposed. So the opportunity for exposure reduction is obviously phthalate-free products and buying less processed and packaged food. And we can be working towards bans of the use of phthalates in food processing, as well as less use of these scented products. Often the scent is to, there are other ways to get rid of unpleasant scents. Sometimes the scents that are in these products are there to camouflage the scents that we don't like very much to be breathing. So really the question here is for phthalates, well, what is the appropriate tipping point? When do we need to wait? And I would say probably most people in TENDR would say the evidence is accumulating and moving forward with reduction of phthalates, which are not necessary products. Some of these chemicals maybe have more of a necessity component to them. The next slide is that second prong. So that was the first prong, the specific chemicals we're targeting, but we also are calling for really an overhaul of our systems for regulation. Maureen already talked about the variety of different kinds of regulation that we have and different agencies involved. That includes the Food and Drug Administration, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the U.S. EPA, and of course many state and local agencies as well. She talked about special vulnerability of children and acting before children are harmed, being proactive. So these are some of the points that we really want to see embedded in the regulation and into the regulatory process. Particularly, though, we want to see a real paradigm shift such that the burden of proof might be a little bit more like what we do for drugs, which is that they are extensively tested for safety and for adverse effects prior to introduction into the market. And of course, even so, sometimes we find that drugs have unintended consequences, and they have to be taken off the market. But in the case of environmental chemicals, the burden of proof has been sort of shifted to us, the public, to find the evidence of harm, rather than the pre-introduction requirement of evidence for safety. And obviously there is some regulation about testing, but it doesn't. In most cases, it does not include testing for neurodevelopment, as Maureen already alluded to. We also, of course, would like to see this process speeded up. Many people are familiar with how TSCA has been, which was passed in the 70s. It has not been a particularly effective means for regulating and protecting, regulating chemicals, with very few that have actually been taken off the market through the TSCA process. We want to end that cycle of replacing one toxic chemical with another. That brings me to the next slide, which is regrettable substitution, pesticides. This is really classic. In the 1940s to 70s, roughly, we had the organochlorines like DDT and heptachlor and a list of another 15 or so pesticides that were highly persistent, that had clear reproductive toxicity, and those chemicals, many of which were highlighted in Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, were then identified through her book, and that information really became well known. And then the chemical industry went to work and came up with organophosphates, which were in fact short-lived and addressed that problem, but continue to have toxicities, particularly for neurodevelopment, that are of concern. And now that chlorpyrifos was actually banned for household use, it's been replaced by pyrethroids and neonicotinoids in those household products, and that is starting to happen to some extent in the agricultural and other widespread uses. And then the question is, well, what about these chemicals? And in fact, we published a paper in 2014 in which we found that not only organophosphates but also pyrethroids were associated with higher risk for autism spectrum disorder in children living within reach of drift from agricultural applications. So this is really a cycle that we have to break out of. And one of the chemists here at UC Davis has talked about how we are deluding ourselves when we think there's going to be that perfect chemical that's going to be toxic to the organisms we want to get rid of and not to other living organisms. There's something about the way nature has us wired that it tends to conserve various kinds of pathways across not only species but families and genera and lower animals as well as higher members of the animal kingdom. Flame retardants also, as Maureen alluded to, have also gone through various cycles, and we are concerned about the replacements for PVDEs as well that are seem to be taking a bigger share of the market now that PVDEs have been virtually banned. And of course, there's the problem with those persistent compounds is that even when they are replaced for their main uses, they are with us for a long time, and the PVDEs being a prime example of that problem, because what they were used in tends to be long-lived in our homes. Project TENDR is calling upon lawmakers, those are elected officials, as well as the regulatory agencies that actually implement those laws and turn them into very specific, how they are enacted, as well as manufacturers, distributors, and retailers to be, refusing to produce and to carry in their supply chain products that contain these chemicals. We are also calling upon health professionals to incorporate knowledge about environmental chemicals in their clinical practice and their public health practice. I think that's not been high in the minds of most medically trained professionals, and I think that needs to change to help really create an environment where it's not acceptable to be bringing these chemicals into the market and continuing to use them. And then also consumers and parents to be in the broad public who can put pressure on all of these different other sectors, and of course can make changes in their own lives where feasible. We've received quite a bit of publicity since the publication of our consensus statement, and these are just a few of the. I want to leave time for some questions. I think we're running a little over here, and so just that's there on your slide. New York Times, CNN, and many other outlets. And then we had a congressional briefing attended last week by 60 House, Senate, and agency staffers, including Senator Murkowski. And next slide is just summarizing again the consensus statement. I won't go through that again, but let me just get to the recommendations on lead. Step 1 is the U.S. government should adopt standards and action levels for lead that rely on the most up-to-date scientific knowledge to set strongest protections for children from lead toxicity and neurodevelopmental impairment. The second step is that U.S. government should prioritize efforts to identify, remediate, and eliminate those still existing sources of lead to protect children before exposure occurs. And then finally, that Congress should set up an independent expert advisory panel to develop a national strategy to eliminate lead exposure. Our goal should be that by 2030, no child has a blood lead concentration more than 1 microgram per deciliter. That's where we should be heading. And kind of these are some of the future projects of TENDR. Some of the next few steps that we'll be taking is publishing our chemical reviews in the scientific literature, and we invite you to visit our website, projecttender.com. And then finally, the final slide is the funders that we thank: John Merck Fund, the Passport Foundation, the Series Trust, and NIEHS. Thank you very much. We can take questions now.
Thank you, Irva. Yeah, I would like to open it up for questions now. So if anyone would like to participate by asking a question or making a comment, you can press *2 to unmute your line. Please also state your name and affiliation, and we ask that you be relatively brief so we can get to a few questions before we're out of time.
This is Mary Gant. I formerly worked for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and I retired last summer. And I'm now Government Affairs Director for the Green Science Policy Institute. I have a question about the Consumer Product Safety Commission's consideration of new regulations for flame retardants in consumer products. Last November, the CPSC held a hearing. A number of groups, very distinguished groups, Arlene Bloom, Linda Birnbaum, the firefighters, I believe, testified on changing the national standards for flame retardants in consumer goods. Nothing's happened. And I was just wondering if how Project TENDR is going to put pressure on organizations, government organizations like the CPSC, to get them to move forward in changing the current standard. California has done the right thing, and I think everybody who testified wanted the national standard to be the California standard.
Hi, this is Maureen. Oh, go ahead.
Well, or maybe you should. This sounds like a topic we should be taking up. I've felt for a long time that the CPSC tends to be very slow. I mean, you know, when I started doing some work on lead in the early 1990s, every few years I would get a call about some new product that now had lead in it that often was marketed for children, and or involves exposures to children, and I was just shocked that we still kept allowing these things to happen. And it was 2008, I believe, before the CPSC finally came up with some kind of policy related to lead in various household products. Perhaps you at the Green Science Policy Institute have some ideas about how we can do that, and I'd certainly like to open up that dialogue with you, perhaps.
Well, we'd certainly
in the near future
talk with you, and we've been working on it. Senator Boxer has written a letter to the CPSC advocating for the adoption of the California standard, and there are a couple of other legislators from California who might be willing to also add their voice. So I think it's going to take a kind of grassroots effort to make it happen.
Hey, Mary, this is Maureen Swanson. I'll be really quick so that we can get to another question or two. But LDA is one of the petitioners on that petition to the CPSC on flame retardants as well. And of course, they still have the petition under consideration, and we provided testimony. Some of the scientists in TENDR also sent in written comments on the petition, but that we are working with Earth Justice, and we would, as Irva said, like to work with you all at the Green Science Policy Institute and others to possibly hold a meeting. We've been talking about holding a meeting of TENDR experts with CPSC to further weigh in in support of the petition.
This is Vi Wari. I have a comment. I'm a St. Lawrence Island UPIC mother and grandmother. Regarding regrettable substitutions, when manufacturers make these toxic chemicals and replace them with another toxic chemical, they need to be held accountable. There needs to be oversight that when they get replaced with another harmful chemical, they should be fined, or, I mean, there's no oversight as far as that. Where I'm from in rural Alaska, our children have already been harmed. We're some of the most highly contaminated population on the planet because of our reliance on subsistence foods, and our homes are closed in more during the winter. So we are being exposed from former military bases, global contaminants in our homes, and our children have the lowest test scores, and that is very alarming to our community, our parents, because how can a population that has lived for many, many generations with knowledge, science-based knowledge of our environment, our wildlife, and you have to have smarts to live in communities up north, in the Arctic. So we need to hold the manufacturers accountable, because we have to think about our children and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Vi. This is Diana. And I think, Irva and Maureen, are you able to stay on just a few more minutes so we can take another question?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just noticed.
Couldn't agree more with.
Oh, yes, and if you'd like to respond to Vi, please go ahead.
And just to say, couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more, and that's this issue of the burden of proof that things, yeah. But let's go on to another caller to get maybe another question.
I think we can get one more question in if it's brief.
Hey, this is Maureen.
Bob Delaney. Oops, sorry. This is Bob Delaney from.
There's two of us trying to talk.
We'll give you both a chance. How about that? Just be really brief, and both of you will get a chance.
All right.
Yeah.
This is Bob Delaney, State of Michigan, and Department of Environmental Quality. My question has to do with the perfluoroalkyl chemicals, PFOS, PFOA. And recently, EPA gave out a health advisory number of 70 parts per trillion for the combined PFOS and PFOA. And what that means is about, right now, they've identified about 5 million people that have been drinking water above those levels. I work on cleanup of Fort Smith Air Force Base here in Michigan. We know that the people that lived on base were drinking water that's maybe 2 orders of magnitude higher in contamination level. And what that means is that there's a huge cohort, many huge cohorts out there under which we could do human health analysis. And I think this is an enormous opportunity to see if there's a link between certain chemicals and certain outcomes. And we generally don't get to have a test where we dose humans, but this is almost set up as a dose type experiment. You know, we've been experimenting on humans for a long time. We just don't call it that. But anyway, has your group thought about that at all? And I'll hang up and listen or go on mute.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. When we selected that short group of four or five chemical classes, we actually reviewed and did a lot of detailed work on about 12 or 13 different classes, and PFCs were definitely in that group. They, you know, for whatever reason, they did not rise to the top. But again, that top is not necessarily the worst or the biggest, or you know, they just were ones that the group decided to select as its prime examples. So this sounds definitely like you know, an opportunity to do some research. And as a researcher, I'd be interested in hearing about that. And I'm sure there may be people right there in Michigan who would be interested in following up or elsewhere in developing some work on that. So maybe we can communicate directly on that.
All right. Well, I sent Diana an email, so you'll have my information there. Thanks.
I'll make sure that gets passed along. And I would just like to invite the person who was also trying to ask a question at the same time to go ahead. And again, just please be brief with your question. And
hey, this is Maureen Lowinger. I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency in Anchorage, and I'm also a member of our Rural Alaska Children's Environmental Health Initiative. And I just wanted to mention one thing, and then I have a quick question. I wanted to point out, you guys were talking about air quality as being a significant impact, and I just want to ensure that you consider that in rural Alaska, rather than ambient air quality, indoor air quality is one of the biggest issues that we see, and I hope that you will keep that under consideration when doing future work with Alaskan communities. That being said, the question that I had is, I was just curious if Project TENDR has done any analysis yet about how the amendment to TSCA, the Frank Lautenberg Act, has, and what you guys think of that so far.
Hi. Do you want to take the first crack? Yeah.
Oh, sure. I'll be brief. So TSCA, after years of negotiations and input by groups across the country, including ACAD and LDA, TSCA finally, the new TSCA law was passed in June, just a couple of weeks before our consensus statement came out, and it's a good step forward. It addresses some new chemicals coming on the market and authorizes EPA to test new chemicals for health effects and identify ones that are harmful. And it also enables EPA to test existing chemicals already out there. EPA right now is prioritizing, I understand, the first set of chemicals. It remains to be seen whether Congress funds EPA adequately to do all this work. There's an enormous backlog of thousands and thousands of chemicals, and whether EPA aggressively implements the new law. But even if it does so, it's right now EPA is directed to assess 10 chemicals at a time per year, which is not that many. And the pace of review will be very slow. And so Project TENDR is much broader and more encompassing, and TSCA is one step forward and a step in the right direction, but it's not nearly sufficient for the magnitude of the problem. Another positive piece of TSCA is that it explicitly seeks to protect vulnerable populations, including pregnant women and children. So that's essential, and that's a wonderful aspect of the new law. But as Irva pointed out, many of these chemicals don't even fall under EPA jurisdiction under TSCA. They're regulated under different statutes like the pesticides, or they're regulated by the FDA for chemicals in food processing and food and drugs and cosmetics. So we see TSCA as one piece that Project TENDR will try to identify ways that we might help with guidance on scientific assessment and evaluation and on implementation, but the issue needs to be addressed much more comprehensively.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are out of time, unless Irva, if you'd like to add any final remarks.
Yeah, and I echo all of what Maureen said. I think one of the issues that is going to end up being contentious over time with this new version, revised TSCA, is the issue of preempting states. And although there seems to be some opportunities for waivers of that's actually fairly restricted in terms of how states could request those waivers and for which chemicals at which time period in the regulatory process. So I think that's going to be a concern over time. With regard to your first point about indoor air, yes, well, absolutely. Indoor air actually often reflects pretty closely what's in the outdoor air. In many, most places, there is, there's circulation in and out, and most of us spend way more of our time indoors than outdoors. So absolutely, but then there are specific things that happen indoors that maybe are less of an issue in the outdoor air. So I agree with the caller on that. The Alaska group.
Okay, well, again, I'd like to thank Ms. Swanson and Dr. Hertz-Picciotto for their time today, and all of you for joining us. An MP3 recording of today's call will be available later today, and I'll be sending an email to all of you to let you know when you can download that. And just a final remark is, if you found today's presentation and discussion valuable, please consider making a donation in support of our monthly CHE Alaska teleconferences, and your gift will help us to continue bringing you these calls. You can make a donation online at akaction.org. And again, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. And thanks for being able to stay over a little bit. I know everyone's time is valuable. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
She does such a good job of